Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, Director of the Middle East Program at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia, and you are listening to the Middle East Brief, a podcast focused on developments in the Middle East and why they matter for U.S. foreign policy. Be sure to subscribe to the Middle East Brief on iTunes and Spotify, and sign up to receive FPRI's Weekly Insights newsletter, where a link to the show will be delivered every 2 weeks straight to your inbox at www.fpri.org. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Joyce Karam. She is the Washington correspondent for The National and a native of Lebanon. And naturally, with events going on in Lebanon, I could think of no other person on the East Coast of the U.S. that I want to talk to about this. So Joyce, welcome to the show.
Hi, Aaron. Great to be with you.
Yeah, it's nice to chat over the phone. Usually, you and I are discussing Syria or something going on on the margins of Twitter, but we're taking our conversations from the private domain to the public domain. So it's nice to chat with you.
I like it. Yeah.
Yeah. So look, I'm not going to entertain the audience with the idea that I'm an expert on Lebanon. I'm going to state flat out that I am not. Although I truly enjoy going to the country. It's a wonderful place. But, you know, if you are following the news even passively like I am, Lebanon is clearly going through an economically difficult time. And that was the instigation for wanting to have this chat with you, Joyce. So maybe you could give the listeners just a basic feel of what's going on with Lebanon on the economic side, and maybe how that intermixes with some of the recent things that have been going on on the political front.
No, for sure. I mean, Lebanon is a wonderful country, great wine, great food, great everything. But yeah, you don't have to be an expert to look at the situation today and see a massive economic crisis. Basically, the economy is going downhill. We are witnessing economic bankruptcy. How did this start? It didn't just start in October of last year when the protests started. It's been building up for successive governments after the war ended in 1990. So we're in a situation where our governments have borrowed large sums of money and they realize they can't pay it back. Why can't they pay it back? How they mismanaged it? Well, big part is corruption. So now you have a small country with very small GDP that's sitting on $86 billion in debt. The Lebanese pound is devaluating as we speak. The government is trying to look at its options, but the reality of things, there are no good options. Day-to-day life has been disrupted. I mean, people are lined up outside banks, outside ATMs, because the country is running short of money. It's very hard to get a dollar. When I was there in October, the dollar value against the Lebanese pound was 1,500 Lebanese pound. Now it's around 4,000. So you can imagine how the prices, how the consumer crisis in dealing with this inflation in prices and so on. What doesn't help either is the Lebanese political elite are deeply corrupt. The country is number 138 on international corruption list. So transparency measures have first and foremost be put in order to get out of this crisis. The current government has said that it's willing to accept an IMF plan. The IMF delegation were just in Lebanon over the weekend. But upon meeting with the Lebanese, they've realized that the Lebanese delegation cannot agree on a road forward. They cannot, there is no consensus between the people in the government and the central bank on what needs to be done. So we are in a very bad situation. The average person is hurting a lot. it may get to a point where you can see more and more protests, and this wave of protests are getting more violent because people are just so fed up. They can't afford buying anything. I mean, from just basic goods to food. It's becoming very hard for the Lebanese public, and this is a very resilient public. I mean, we've gone through a war. We've managed to get through, several turns and twists in our history, but it was never that bad. You're seeing poverty and you're seeing hunger and economic desperation to a point that's very alarming, and in a region that's already very turbulent.
Right. I mean, it's a big challenge for the new prime minister. There was political turmoil with the former prime minister, Prime Minister Hariri, because of maybe sort of a different set of circumstances, given his the twists and turns of the political winds in the Middle East between competing countries, and how Lebanon is often used as how Lebanon often falls victims to broader politics, perhaps between the Saudis and the Iranians. But
Mm-hmm.
you have a new government that took over in January 2020, if I'm not January 2020, if I'm not mistaken, and they basically walked into both the COVID-19 crisis and this economic crisis. Can you talk a little bit about how they're trying to manage that, and how they, what political parties and what political blocs underneath them are trying to angle for in terms of influencing government policy?
Yes, so the new Prime Minister, Hassan Diab, is somebody who comes from an academic background. He was a professor at the American University of Beirut. But the problem with him is not his academic background. It's mostly he made it to the cabinet. So he was voted as prime minister by one bloc in the parliament, and this bloc is pro-Hezbollah, the Lebanese militia that's backed by Iran. So that immediately boxes him in a certain political framework, even though he's trying to say my government is technocrats, it's independent, we are not pro Hezbollah, we are here to put forth a rescue plan for the country. It's been 5 months, and he hasn't been able to do that. So he's definitely in a tough situation when it comes to the economic rescue plan. On COVID-19, though, it's interesting to see how the country, a small country like Lebanon, was able to do a relatively good job in handling the crisis. You have, I think, a total of 26 deaths in the country, which is lower than other places in the region. And you've seen the government, the health ministry, go very early on. I mean, before the United States, before other countries, and shut down schools and enforce a relatively strict lockdown. So in that sense, they were able to succeed on the COVID-19 front. And because of the pandemic, because of everything in Lebanon, the protests stopped during that period. Now we're seeing the protests come back. We've seen banks being attacked in Tripoli. We're seeing protests in Beirut. So as Lebanon faces out of the pandemic, you're most likely to see more public pressure growing on the government, especially as the economic situation continues to worsen. And I'm not sure that Hassan Diab, even if he may have the best of intentions, can actually navigate the different political divides in the country and deal with the economic situation and get regional support and IMF support. So all in all, we're probably getting into a very volatile summer in Lebanon. You may see protests, you may see more poverty, more economic desperation until the country figures out the terms that it can accept from the IMF. There is no other solution at the time being.
Before we sort of turn to the role of Hezbollah in Lebanese politics, because that's obviously a lot of people are interested in that. It's often hard to sort of ascribe a singular motive to protesters. You look wherever there's a large scale protest movement, whether it be Iraq, whether it be sort of elements in the United States. My own personal background going into Turkey with the Gezi Park things. It's always very hard to say like this is what the protesters want. But that's the question I'm going to ask you. Like, if you could try and encapsulate what it is that these protesters want, and if we could sort of extrapolate that as the lockdowns in Lebanon ease, and as the sort of confluence of issues, I guess pushback against what many people perceive to be a corrupt political elite, the economic downturn that you're talking about, the very likelihood that an IMF bailout would entail structural reforms to an economy that don't necessarily always favors the man or woman on the street. What is it that these protesters are pushing for? What is it that they're dissatisfied with in Lebanese society, and like where would you say that they're going?
It's very hard to pinpoint one driving force for these protests. I mean, from the north and Akkar and Tripoli to the south and Nabatieh, people may have different reasons for coming out. But one defining theme that I found, during this protest movement is it's a very organic movement, and it's mostly driven by anti-corruption. They've watched the country, slide backwards since 1991. They are just sick and tired of, a political elite that recycles itself, a political elite that just keeps amassing private jets, and millions, while they can't even afford basic goods at the end of the day. So this is what's driving these people. Now, of course, if you look at Tripoli, for example, you have some of the protesters. They want the government to free Islamists that are in prison. If you go to Sidon or Nabatieh or other more Shia places, they are, they want, they're sick and tired of Hezbollah dominance. So it may vary, but the common theme is very much anti-corruption, anti-political elite, whether it's from the Christian or the Sunni or the Shia side. It's across the board, and it's the very first time we see something like this take place in Lebanon. Even after our war, these same leaders that were involved in the leading militias and running thugs around the country, they were the same people who got to enter government and lead the political system. So we never saw new leadership emerge, and people have lost confidence in this leadership, and they want to see organic change. I don't know if this could happen or not. As you've mentioned, a lot of regional bickering and influence goes into Lebanon. For the U.S., it's mostly the biggest interest, the biggest strategic drive is anti-Hezbollah. So we'll see where the protests will take, but definitely what's happening in the streets is new. It's organic, and it's against the political spectrum, regardless of the sectarian, belonging for these politicians.
Yeah, so this is where I want to bring in the Hezbollah aspect of this. One of the things that makes Lebanese politics particularly interesting, on top of its many interesting facts dating back to the sort of the end of the war and the way that the country's political system is structured, is that within that you have Hezbollah that's emerged as a popular political party, and the consternation that entails because of obviously its paramilitary wing that a lot of people, particularly in the U.S., are dissatisfied with, to put it mildly. How does Hezbollah fit into this sort of current state of Lebanese politics, both with its relationship and underpinning of support for the prime minister, but also how it's trying to manage the economic crisis and the protests itself?
I mean, it's a very tough situation for Hezbollah, because the rise of the party, in the 80s was framed around the party of the poor, the party of the resistance. And what we're seeing now is a very different Hezbollah. It's since going into Syria in 2013, it had to, justify its intervention in the Syrian war. And since entering government in 2005, it's more or less now part of this political elite in Lebanon. So this is very much against what Hezbollah was seen as when it emerged in the 80s. For now, I think Hezbollah they don't want complete collapse. Yes, they are the most organized, and they are by far the strongest political and military organization in the country, non-state organization in the country, but they don't want a full collapse of the economy, because they realize they will also lose. Lebanon has been their harbor, has been their main presence, and they're very invested in the current government, partly because it's one that's supported by their allies. But I think the minute that they see the protests are going out of hand, they could shift gears. They are a very pragmatic party, and they could go for another Hariri government or nominate someone else. But when you look at the protests, we're seeing them for example, in Nabatiye or in other areas where Hezbollah enjoys support, like in Baalbek. This is new. And this is not something that the party knows how to address. They've tried to crack down. They've sent their people, sometimes with scooters, to destroy tents, to do whatever. But they haven't been able to completely just shut off the protests. So what this movement could bring is definitely more challenges to Hezbollah. And it just reinforces the change of the image of the party from the 80s and the 90s as a resistance group against Israel, to what we're seeing it become today, an influential political and military organization that's fighting in regional wars, and that very much benefit from the political system and privileges in Lebanon, like everyone else.
There's something manifestly interesting about a revolutionary political party, who sort of enters middle age, then is having to deal with the revolutionary upstarts that now think of it as very unrevolutionary and just kind of a big irritant.
Definitely. I mean, I don't think they know how to react to this, because this is not This was not part of their original playbook. And it's now, they have to face their supporters and say, yeah, we want to be in government. We want to benefit from the system. And guess what? We don't want the same sectarian system that you all hate to collapse, because we're also part of it.
Yeah, yeah. That there are probably scores of PhDs and social scientists who look at this, and I'm just unfamiliar with their research, but I'll have to dig deeper into this. I think the last thing, and one of the points when I started this podcast is that it's the intersection of events in the Middle East, but then why they matter for the U.S. And I think obviously there are multitudes of issues that intersect with U.S. interests that stem out of Lebanon. But one of the things, and you and I were talking about just before we hit record here, is the UNIFIL mission in the south. And obviously that intersects with Hezbollah, that intersects with perhaps sort of the points of view and the more aggressive points of view that the Trump administration has against Iran, and all these things, how they come together in this one point of territory on the map. So maybe you can go into the latest on that before we wrap up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean that's another worrisome aspect, that what happens in Lebanon does not just stay in the country. We border Israel and Syria. And you've had since I think since the 80s a UN force in the south to sort of manage the conflict, or manage now the cold peace between Israel and Hezbollah. But it hasn't done as good as a job as, for example, the U.S. administration or Israel want them to. You've continued to see arms smuggling into Hezbollah, and repeated violations by Israel flying into Lebanon, and by Hezbollah sometimes flying drones into Israel from that border. So now we are at a point where the UN is looking to renew the mandate of the UNIFIL, but both the US and Israel want bigger authority for UNIFIL. They want sort of a mandate with teeth for UNIFIL to be able to stop the smuggling and to go harder against Hezbollah. But that's not something that the UN may be able to pass. The Europeans are not too keen on that. They want just stability. The French don't want to rock the boat too much in Lebanon. And the US is basically threatening to withdraw its funding for UNIFIL if its mandate doesn't change. So this will be another battle added to Lebanon's list of concerns and battles going on in the summer. We will know in August whether the UNIFIL mandate will be renewed or not. But you are seeing more tension emerge on that in South Lebanon, in the area between behind the blue line, the border, and Israel. So this is where it is. People who have seen the July war between Hezbollah and Israel are very concerned of another round of Lebanon, having to pay the price again for brutal conflict and reasons that the Lebanese state cannot even control or manage at this point.
So, I mean, as we wrap up here, I mean, where is this going? We have this really, we have the pandemic has, it's like an accelerant to make political and social trends in countries worse. So, I mean, if you're just looking at things like in Lebanon, like Lebanon was staring down a financial crisis that was going to be very hard to avoid. The resulting shutdowns in what was an appropriate way to handle COVID-19 has has just sped up the inevitable, right? The protesters were before COVID, they will come back after COVID, and that these protests will, graft onto this and probably accelerate, maybe not in a way of people gathering outside, but accelerate in the way of anger at the social inequalities that stem from the economic downturn. And then you have these sort of self-interested actors like Hezbollah, UNIFIL, Prime Minister, all these things all the things that we talked about over this 20 minutes. So in closing here, I mean, if we're just projecting out, what are the things to watch for if a casual person wanted to pick up the New York Times or the National and figure out what was going on, things to look at, potential trigger points, what were things that you would point to as, oh, this is a big deal and this is a continuation of some of these negative trends that we've been talking about? And alternatively, what would be positive?
Many negative trends to look at. First, you want to see if the protests resume as the country reopens, in the coming week. So that's one. Second, you want to see what happens with the UNIFIL mandate in New York, with the meetings ongoing, and how will the international community vote in August. Third, of course, what's going to happen to the economic indicators coming from Lebanon? Will people be able to buy milk, buy chicken at a logical price? Right now, it's not. So among the last negative trend that you want to see, what happens in the tit for tat between Hezbollah and Israel, and that also now involves Syria. So these are four negative trends. The only positive trend that we see is, apart from fighting COVID, is the IMF negotiations with the government. If that succeeds, if you could put Lebanon on a path for economic recovery that involves fighting corruption, that involves real reforms at the airport, at the borders, at the electricity and water sectors, that would be a turning point for Lebanon. But for that to succeed, you need the Lebanese to come together around a plan to negotiate with the IMF and be serious about these reforms. Yes, Hezbollah may not like some of these reforms. Other, corrupt leaders in the country who benefit from the current lawlessness may have problems with the IMF plan too, but that's the only way forward. Otherwise, I mean, you could be looking at, a Venezuela in the Middle East, and that's honestly the last thing we want at the moment.
Joyce, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time. I certainly learned a lot, and difficult times ahead. But I don't think Lebanon is alone in that. But it's certainly something as a Middle East focused podcast I'll be watching. So hope to have you back again sometime, and hopefully with some better news. So thank you for.
Thanks, Aaron, so much. Take care.
My pleasure. Have a good rest of the day, and thank you everybody for listening.